Hi everybody, welcome back to English 90. This is for our class for the 4th of October, where we are talking about the third and fourth step in writing, and we are also talking about journals. So you should have submitted in your first journal, and I'm working on returning those. If you haven't already received your journal back, you should shortly. And you can see that journal number 2 is going to be due on this upcoming Wednesday. That is October 6th. And that will be at the ending of the day, 11:59 p.m. And it is about sleep and disease risk. And you can see in the notes below that I have given you the link where you can find the article. And again, for the journal, what I'm asking you to do is to read the article, to summarize it, to talk about the main points in the article, and then to give your response. And you can see that what I've done is that I've reviewed your writing and I've made some suggestions on ways that you could improve the writing or places where there were errors. But I didn't put a formal grade on it. It's a checkmark system. So basically a check plus is very good, which is where most of the grades end up. There is a plus, which is excellent, and there's also a check minus, which is a less than satisfactory. A check is satisfactory. So, and basically what you want to do is each time that I give you an article is that you read that article, you try to determine the main points, and you indicate what those main points are along with your response. Now, you've probably noticed that we haven't talked much about grammar yet. We will be talking about grammar soon. Actually, we're going to begin talking about parts of speech in today's class. So some of the comments that I made in the journals may not necessarily make sense at this particular point in time. For instance, I might have written something like fragment in your journal, and we haven't talked about sentence fragments yet, but we will be talking about sentence fragments over the next several classes. So what you could do is wait until we get to that point, or you can always ask me and I'll be happy to fill you in, or you can always look it up in the textbook or some combination thereof. But by the ending of the semester, we would have gotten to all of those elements that I would have discussed in any of and all of your journals. And some of the elements are things that we've already talked about. So for instance, we've talked about the importance of spelling and how ultimately you want to be able to use things like your computer spell check in order to be able to find the correct forms of words. That's one of the best ways that your computer is useful to you in terms of the writing process is the spell check function. Though if two words are basically not necessarily spelled the same way, but can be spelled in different ways. The computer isn't going to necessarily know which one you meant to use in that particular context, but the computer can catch many spelling errors, and it would behoove you to use the spell check as well as using the cut and paste option in the computer. The idea that you can move text around very easily. I know that there's a grammar function on the computer, and it's not that accurate, at least at this particular point. I don't know if that's going to be changing as the computer programs become more sophisticated. So I think of the grammar function much like a smart friend who is sometimes wrong. But the grammar function can give you at least some suggestions. But definitely the spell check is very useful to you, and definitely the cutting and the pasting option so that you can keep multiple drafts. And soon we will start talking about our first formal writing assignment, what I'm calling paper number 1. In fact, we'll begin discussing that next class. But at this point, we're still talking about the opening elements of getting ready for writing a paper. And you know, we've been talking about writing in steps and stages rather than trying to write all at once. At the last minute, that you start early and you do it in pieces. And we are at the third step in writing right now. And that happens to be about organization and transitions. So that was chapter 4 on pages 85 to 111. And you have some decisions to make when you are writing. Once you have decided what your points are going to be after you've done some brainstorming, you need to decide how you are going to organize those points. And there are lots of different ways that you could go about doing that, and all of them are equally valid. So for instance, you could do something like chronological. Organize your points based on time order. This works very well if you're trying to teach somebody how to do something. First something happened, then afterwards. So you can see how basically you're going in terms of steps in a process. Emphatic organization is order of importance. And you can do this one of two ways. You can put the most important argument first to impress your readers. But the difficulty with that is that as your readers continue on, then your arguments become less persuasive. So they may not necessarily stick with you to the end, so to speak, if you put everything up front initially. That said, you could put your most important argument last. In other words, leave the reader with a lasting impression. But you have to hope that the reader will stay with you until you work your way up to that point. So there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way to do this. It depends on a number of variables. It depends on the subject that you're talking about. It depends on who your audience is going to be. It depends on you and your comfort level. You know, I oftentimes talk about real estate agents in this context and how they go about selling a house and how they put together their arguments. And there are lots of variables they have to consider. So for instance, if they were working with a very old property, they might want to talk about that house in terms of time order and that, you know, it was built in the mid 1800s, for instance, and then they can give you a history of the house to present day. However, they might want to talk about that house in terms of order of importance. And they might want to put the most important element first, which happens to be that the house is located in a good neighborhood. Or they might want to put that point last. Again, there are pros and cons to each. And what's most important is subjective. So for one family buying that house, neighborhood might be most important. But for another family looking at that house, it's the price of the house that's most important. So this is something that you need to consider as well. Who is your audience and what is the best way of putting together an argument? Or think about spatial organization, where you are organizing things based on appearance. And again, this works very nicely if you were trying to describe a house. So if you were, again, that real estate agent, you could talk about walking into the home, and immediately to your left is the living room, and immediately in front of you is a small staircase that leads to the kitchen. Off to the right is a bedroom that could be used as a den. Off to the left is a dining room, and off of the dining room is a sliding glass door that leads to a deck. Now, you've never been in this house, but my description at least gives you a sense of what it could be like. So that's another organizational pattern that you might decide to use. And you can mix and match organizational patterns, but what you want to do is think about what's going to make the most sense to your audience. For instance, you know, if I were to ask you to visualize, let's say, a file cabinet, you would assume that if you open the drawer of the file cabinet, you would find files, and probably they would be alphabetized. If you opened up the drawer and you found something like food instead, well, you'd be very surprised. And it would be more difficult for you to, let's say, negotiate that office if the files were not in the file cabinet, but someplace else. So you have to sort of think about what it is that your audience would expect from you. Now, one of the things that you also want to consider in addition to your organizational pattern are transitions, words that you can use to help connect ideas. This is very useful in terms of helping the reader stay oriented with your particular topic. This is on page specifically 89 to 90, where there are lots of suggestions about the ways that you can use transitions. For instance, if you wanted to have an addition signal, and this is on page 89, it might be a page that you may want to highlight. Words like one or first or second or the third reason or also or next, all of these indicate addition. Or time signals, things like first, then, next, after, before, meanwhile, soon, all of that indicates time. Or space signals, next to, across, on the opposite side, to the left, to the right, above, below, that indicates location. Change of direction signals, very important, almost like when you're driving and you want to be able to use your turn signals to let the drivers behind you know that you are going to be changing your direction. Words like but, however, yet, in contrast, although, you can see there are many other examples here. I'm just reading a few. Illustration examples to show that you are planning on giving additional depth or detail about an item. For example, for instance, specifically. And conclusion signals, letting the reader know that you're coming to an end. Therefore, consequently, thus, then, as a result. So these are all wonderful words to use in addition to your organizational pattern in order to make sure that your writing flows and that things make sense. Now, there are other connecting words that you can use as well that the textbook talks about on page 94 to 95. For instance, you can repeat words. Now, repetition is usually considered to be a bad thing, but if you wanted to remind your reader about a particular item, you could repeat that word several times in the course of, let's say, your paragraph, and if you were writing a paragraph. Or a pronoun. A pronoun takes the place of a noun. A noun is a person, place, thing, or idea. We'll talk a little bit more about that next class. Pronouns are words like he, she, it, they. That oftentimes is a way to connect ideas so that you don't have to repeat over and over again. So if you're talking about Greenfield Community College, you might mention Greenfield Community College a couple of times. You might repeat it. But eventually you're going to get to the point where you're going to want to say something else. For instance, it, in reference to Greenfield Community College as the pronoun. Or you might want to use a synonym, a word that has a similar meaning. So you could, instead of talking about Greenfield Community College, you could talk about the school. And again, that's another way of saying Greenfield Community College. So synonyms, if you'll remember, are words that you can look up in a thesaurus, whether you've got a print copy. Roget's thesaurus is probably one of the most famous, or you're using a online copy or some combination thereof. And if you can't think of a word that's similar, you can go to the thesaurus and look up the word, such as the word cold. And what you can find are lots of words with similar meanings to cold. Frigid, freezing, chilly, so forth. They all are slightly different than the word cold, but they're also very similar. So perhaps you could use something in place of cold if you were to go to your thesaurus, if you couldn't think of another word as a substitute. And then the text talks about introductions and conclusions, which is something that we are going to be working on later on in the semester when they talk about the introductory paragraph and the concluding paragraph in the textbook. Because our first writing assignment that I will be discussing next class is going to be for you to write a well-written paragraph, just one paragraph. And you can always write more, but you don't want to write less. And I want to make sure that everybody understands a paragraph is a well-developed piece of writing. And in fact, I see that there are examples of paragraphs on pages 90 to 92. And you can see that the thing that all of these paragraphs share is length. These are paragraphs that are multiple sentences long, 10, 12, 14 sentences long. So we want to work on writing well-developed paragraphs, not just paragraphs that are 3 sentences long, or anything less than 3 sentences is technically not even a paragraph. And you can see in the notes below, I've indicated that a paragraph has a topic sentence. That's usually the first sentence that gives the main point and then of that paragraph. And then there are supporting sentences. This is where your evidence comes in. In last class, we were talking about the importance of 3. So hopefully you've got 3 pieces of evidence and details to support each of those pieces of evidence. So that's where the length comes in. And then you've got a concluding sentence. And this is where you've got closure, where you're sort of tying things up. And again, on pages 90 to 92, there are lots of examples of paragraphs when they are asking you in activity 2 to identify things like change of direction signals and space signals and so forth. So we'll revisit the idea of paragraphs next class. But as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of the introduction and conclusion, because the text talks about it when you start writing multiple paragraphs. Because when you start writing an academic essay, which is what we will be doing in the middle of the semester, then you need to have an entire paragraph devoted to just an introduction, just letting the reader know what it is you're going to be talking about. And you will eventually need to have a conclusion as well, an entire paragraph devoted to letting the reader know that you are finishing. And there are lots of techniques that you can utilize. And even though we aren't necessarily writing something right now with multiple paragraphs for our first writing assignment, you can still use these techniques with one well-developed paragraph. The introduction should have something like a thesis, and your paragraph as well should have a basically first sentence, an opening sentence, the topic sentence that basically tells us what the paragraph is about. That's very much like a thesis. But if you were going to be writing an entire paragraph devoted to introducing an essay, then basically your thesis would be the summary of the entire essay. You can also use this technique in the conclusion. You can also remind the reader what your thesis or main point was. You can do that in the concluding paragraph, and you can do that at the ending of writing a paragraph as well. Or you can talk about the opposite thing that you're planning on discussing. So for instance, you could be writing a paragraph about how back in the past, individuals would oftentimes rely on using books, and now in the future or in the present they're using the internet, and in the future who knows what it is that we will be using. But you could spend an entire paragraph just talking about the world of books before you transition over to the world of the internet. And you could do the same as well when writing a paragraph. You could begin by talking about the opposite thing you're planning on discussing, and then talk about the actual thing. Or just stating that a topic is important or an idea is important is a great way to begin or end either a paragraph or an essay. Stories. People love stories. Now, the story has to be related to the actual topic that you're discussing, but telling a story that's related, again, you can do that within a longer paragraph, or you can do that in an introduction or a conclusion of an essay when you are writing those paragraphs. A quotation. Now, the quotation needs to be relevant to the topic that you are discussing. And if you are looking for a quotation, a very good resource is called Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. And you can find that online as well as in print. But basically, as you know, you can find just about anything online. So if you were looking for a quotation that's applicable to whatever it is that you happen to be discussing, you can always do an online search. And the idea behind the quote is that this helps to introduce a topic that you're going to be discussing, or it gives closure to a topic that you're discussing. So those are just some techniques that you can utilize for beginnings and endings, whether it be the beginnings and endings of a paragraph or the beginnings and endings of an essay that's multiple paragraphs long. And we'll talk about both over the course of this semester. Now, your writing also has to have a title. So you need to be able to title it. The title should be something specific to what it is that you are going to be discussing in your essay. The title does not need to be a complete sentence. It can just be several words. And you don't need to underline, bold, or italicize, or make a bigger font out of your title. Your title should be in standard text, just like everything else is in standard text. Now, there are conventions for things that have been published. In other words, eventually you probably will be referencing essays, or you might be referencing pieces of literature. And what we do is, if the work is longer, like a book, let's say, it's either underlined or italicized. If the work is shorter, let's say something like a short story, it's put in quotation marks. But you only underline or italicize or put in quote marks if something has been published, which is not the case with your own original writing. And again, what I'm going to do next class is to give you some paper topics, and it'll be based on basically questions about your own experiences. So definitely this is not something that should have been published beforehand. This is a piece of original writing that you are doing, utilizing the suggestions we've been talking about over the course of the semester. Major words are capitalized in titles. So basically, if it's a small word, like a or an or the, those are known as articles, by the way, if you're looking for the grammatical term for that. If it's a small word like a or an or the, you don't need to capitalize unless it is the first word in the title. But all of the other words, the major words, need to be capitalized. And these are points that I might have made in your first journal if you reference the title. And I suggest that that might be a good way to begin with a summary, giving the title and the name of the author or the publisher, the place of publication, and then talking a little bit about what the main points are. So, transitioning over to grammar, I wanted to begin by talking about parts of speech. We're not necessarily going to talk about all the parts of speech. We're just going to talk about those parts of speech that are necessary to avoid the most common grammatical mistakes. So, this leads us to talking about a part of speech that I suspect you probably have heard of before. It's called a verb, and that means it's an action word. And we will talk about that. If you are trying to look at the grammar of a sentence, the construction of a sentence, it's probably easiest to begin with the verb to try to identify a verb, because every sentence has to have at least one verb. There are probably multiple verbs, but if a sentence does not have a verb, it is not a complete sentence. And we'll talk about that grammatical error, which is called a fragment, as the semester progresses. So some action words are pretty obvious, because you can visualize the action, like talking and walking and eating and things of that nature. Some verbs may not be as obvious because you can't necessarily see these things happening. For instance, thinking or believing, but these are also verbs. And probably the most complicated verb of all is the verb to be, to exist. And all forms of to be, I am, you are, he, she is, all of these are verbs. Now, that said, what you can see happens with verbs is that the tense or the time period is indicated by the use of the verb, and also who is engaging in the action. That's called the subject, and we will be discussing that in further depth next class. And the problem with the verb to be is that it doesn't follow any of the rules, because there are usually rules that are followed when we talk about a verb. I walk, you walk, he, she walks, they walk. So, and we just are accustomed to doing this so that we can translate it over to I talk, you talk, he, she talks. Notice the he, she form uses an S. They talk. And of course, if we wanted to go in the past tense, we use an ed. I talked, or you talked, or he, she talked. But all verbs don't necessarily follow those rules. They're known as irregular verbs because they don't follow the rules. So you can't say, I slept. Instead, you say, I slept. And most of us just sort of learn this as we are first learning language. So if English is your first language, you're at an advantage because you probably learned it when you were an infant. If English is a language that you learned when you were older, then it's going to be a little bit more complicated to memorize those irregular verbs. And the verb that probably is the most irregular is the form of to be, because each form it's different, because it should be I be, you be, he, she bees, and that's incorrect. Instead, it's I am. And then you would think, well, it's I am, you am, he, she ams. No, it's I am, you are, he, she is. So am, are, and is are all different forms of the verb to be. So again, that's probably something that you've just acquired naturally through your studies of language and your use of language. But keep this idea of verbs in mind as we continue on this semester, because we are soon going to be talking about the most common grammatical errors that occur with writers and how to try to correct those errors. And one of the ways that you can do that is by identifying parts of speech. And one of the parts of speech that is important in identification for finding mistakes is the verb. So that's enough for verbs for now. And you can see also that in the notes below, I've got for our next class, we're going to discuss paper number 1. We're going to talk about the next step in writing, which happens to be the 4th step in writing. And lastly, we're going to begin with grammar. So now that we're talking about grammar, I thought that could be today's attendance question. That would be due on Wednesday, the 5th at 10 a.m. Though certainly if you need additional time, let me know. What is your biggest challenge with grammar and why? What do you think your biggest challenge with grammar is and why? And again, remember that we will be having a journal due on Wednesday at the ending of the day, but I'll remind you for that for Wednesday's class. It's an article about sleep and disease risk. So I hope you find it to be useful to you. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about grammar and the writing process. Bye-bye.